就在几天前，1月12号，美国总统川普在他的社交媒体 Truth Social 上发了一篇帖子，直接点名微软，内容很直接。我绝不希望美国人因为数据中心而支付高昂的电费。他还说，微软将从本周开始做出重大的改变，确保美国人不用为他们的电力消耗买单。这番话的背景呢，是 AI 革命带来的巨大的能源焦虑。数据中心，特别是为 AI 服务的这些数据中心，是众所周知的电老虎。随着 AI 的爆发式增长呢，各地居民开始担心这些科技巨头的用电量会挤占公共资源，最终导致自己的电费账单飙升。这种担忧并非空穴来风，一些地方已经出现了针对数据中心建设的抵制活动。就在川普发帖的第二天，1月13号，微软的总裁布拉德·史密斯迅速在官方博客上发表了一篇名为《构建社区优先的 AI 基础设施》的文章，承诺成为一个好邻居。这5点承诺核心就是川普帖子里面提到的关键：自掏腰包。微软明确表示，他们将支付更高的电价，以覆盖数据中心所需的电力成本，包括新建发电设施和电网升级的费用。他们主动要求公用事业公司和州委员会设定足够高的费率，确保数据中心的成本不会转嫁给居民。同时，微软还宣布，他们不会再接受任何税收减免或者电价的折扣。这个举动可以说是开创了超大规模云服务商的先河。在过去，科技公司在地方建设大型项目的时候呢，往往会利用其带来的就业和税收作为一个筹码，向地方政府索取各种优惠政策，其中就包括廉价的电力。微软这次180度的大转弯，标志着一个时代的结束。除了电费，微软还承诺将用水量降到最低，并通过水资源补充项目回馈给居民比他们使用过的水更多的水。他们会为当地居民创造就业条件，增加地方税收，并投资当地的 AI 培训和非盈利的组织。这一整套组合拳用意呢，是平息当地居民的一个焦虑，为 AI 基础设施的扩张扫清障碍。微软还特别提到了一些已经落地的案例。在怀俄明州，微软与当地的电力公司 Black Hills Energy建立了合作，确保数据中心的增长能够增强而非拖累当地的社区。在威斯康辛州，微软正在支持一种新的费率结构，对超大客户，包括了数据中心，收取足以覆盖其电力成本的费用，从而保护居民不受影响。然而，在 All-In 的最新一期的节目中，几位主播认为，微软的方案虽然值得称赞，但仅仅是解决了问题的第一层，这只是一个治标不治本的创可贴。
I really like it.It's a very good first order set of things to do, which is to step into a local area and take all of these energy issues off the table, at least to the extent that you're contributing to it. The problem is that the data centers are only part of the problem. The reality is that we have a whole new way of living that is drawing more and more electrons. We are at a shortage for what we need.The reaction of the utilities is to now build, which is the right reaction. The problem is that for the last 20 years, they've been underbuilding. So as they catch up, even if you have the data centers that are willing to pay their fair share, rates will still go up. So what do we need to do that is beyond what Microsoft just announced? I think all the hyperscalers should copy what Microsoft did.I think it's great that the president was able to get these guys to the table to agree to it. What is the next major thing? The next major thing is when you actually create $100 or $200 billion tax equity vehicle, and you have them completely subsidize and pay for the electricity costs of homeowners. How do you do that? You do that by paying for them to get solar and storage. Why would they do that?They would do that for two reasons. Number one, and the most important, is that it will give them a social license to operate throughout the country. The second reason is that the president preserved the ability to make those kinds of investments and be tax advantaged for doing it in the One Big Beautiful Bill. So if you put these two things together, I think step one is you go into a local area, you tell the local residents, we'll pay for the water, we'll make sure there's minimal noise,and we'll make sure that we take absolutely no discount. We pay our fair share, even if it means paying more than you do for electricity. That's step one. But now I think we need to go in with step two. Here is a bunch of money that we have allocated to go and fit your house out with solar, with storage, with next generation heat pumps, with a modern set of infrastructure so that you are totally resilient, and now you are completely ambivalent to what the grid has to do in reaction to all the demand that's coming.
Yeah. I had Zach Dell from Base Power on This Week in Startups, I don't know, a year ago now. And we were talking about this, and I said, hey, why wouldn't you just, and what they do is not solar, because solar takes time. You got to rip up your roof. There's some complications with solar. You need to have the space for it. It's expensive to install. They just put a battery, like a little R2D2 outside your house. They fill up that battery when energy is cheap and plentiful, and they deploy it when it's expensive and the grid has challenges. And he said those kind of deals are in the works, or the discussions were happening. And that was back then. So this is a really easy win-win-win type situation, Chamath, you're describing. Sacks, this feels like proactive now, thoughtful ways to communicate to the populace of, hey, the AI boom is here and you have concerns, we're going to get ahead of them. So have you been involved in any of these discussions? Are you talking with Chris Wright and like overlapping in terms of the communication here? Or is it just a free market solution?
Well, Jason, the president's been ahead of the curve on this issue really since the beginning of the administration. I don't know if you recall, but he said that he was going to make AI companies into the biggest power companies because he understood that the data centers that they needed required a lot of power, but they were going to stand up their own power generation and they wouldn't just draw off the grid. And so I think this understanding has always been there. When I've talked to the hyperscalers, they also tell me that their plan is not to draw from the grid, is to basically set up their own power generation behind the meter. It's called co-location. And in fact, I think ultimately this will bring down rates for residential consumers for two reasons. One is that when the data centers create their own power, they can sell back or donate back to the grid when they connect. They don't have to connect to the grid, but once they do, they can donate back. And then second, there's a number of fixed costs in power generation. It's not just variable, right? There's these large fixed costs. And so as you increase scale, those fixed costs get amortized over a greater amount of supply, and that brings down the variable rate, basically the metered rate for everybody. So scale is good. And I think the deceptive nature of the criticism here about like Bernie Sanders and people like that is what they say is, well, we just have to shut down all the data centers, period. When the real problem here is that he and others like him have overregulated power generation to death so that it's too hard to set up net new power, right? I mean, if power generation were easier, there wouldn't need to be a limit on what the data centers could use. They could just bring their own power. So that is the obvious solution here. And it's good to see Microsoft make this pledge and sort of formalize that. I think all the other hyperscalers will do that. Again, it was never part of their plan, I think, to draw on the grid for their power needs. They always, I think, understood that they'd have to stand up their own power. And the issue is just regulations getting in the way of that. And just one final point on this is that there are a bunch of regulations by FERC, for example, that interfere with the ability to do co-location. Co-location is when you put a data center and the power generation next to each other, or you do them together. And Chris Wright, the Secretary of Energy, has directed FERC to make a bunch of changes to make behind the meter and co-location easier so that these data centers can stand up their own power. And the only reason that hasn't happened is just because of the usual bureaucratic delays, but that is well on its way to happening.
All right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes total sense. And, you know, if we start thinking about incentives obviously matter. And I don't think a lot of people know this, but and I think I talked about it when we were talking about nuclear, Friedberg. In France, the people who live near the Avon, I think is how it's pronounced, reactor, they pay 0.1% tax versus the 12% regional average. And so and then I think the UK has also talked about these sort of danger zone or proposals and payments. You can give people a discount to incentivize them and reward them, giving them free local electricity, et cetera, for living near a nuclear power plant. That hasn't come up here in the United States. And there's been a lot of FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt, Friedberg, around these data centers, people throwing around a lot of talking points. I think you and I discussed offline the misperceptions about water usage, and that the water usage is largely recycled in these data centers. If you know about that, would you inform the audience about that piece of data?
Well, we got a lot of water. It just goes around in a circle. So I don't think that's an issue.
But clean water and the cost of clean water increasing for a local population is the issue, and the misperception there.
The modern cooling systems in these data centers, the water recirculates and transports the heat out of the data center. So it's not like the water is used up. I guess there's a separate type of evaporative cooling that does use up some water, but modern data centers don't use that. So the water issue is really a total hoax, and it's really kind of a sub-hoax of this larger affordability issue. I'm not saying that affordability isn't an issue, but it was caused by Biden's 9% inflation, and now Democrats are trying to make it an issue. When it comes to the power for data centers, again, this all comes back to the fact that the regulations make it too hard to generate net new power. So again, scaling demand on its own, not a problem if you also scale supply of electricity. In fact, it brings down prices for everyone because scale creates economies of scale.
Yeah. And 90% of that water is reused. And there's closed water loop systems. And
here's my pitch. I think the president should try to create a $300, $400, $500 billion tax equity fund and help eliminate the electricity costs of 50 to 100 million American households.
Amazing.
Well, here's the, let me give you the math. So we consume in this country about 4 trillion kilowatt hours of electricity. Average price is 18 cents a kilowatt hour. So it's about, call it $750 billion of spend on electricity every year. 1/3 of that, 250 billion, is residential consumption. 2/3 of that, 500 billion, is industrial and commercial consumption. Theoretically, you could increase the price on industrial and commercial consumption by, call it 50%, and make all residential electricity in the United States free. If you're a residential user, you get a cap of free electricity every month. And if you use more than that cap, you get charged. But below that cap, you're free based on whatever square footage of your house. I don't know, whatever. And then on the commercial and industrial side, the reason you would then have an incentive to build private power systems would be that you can bring your cost down. And instead of centralizing all of this with the utilities, what it can do is it can force a market demand for industrial and commercial users to build their own power systems, which would increase overall electricity supply in the United States. The data centers are the tip of the iceberg, but if you make this a pan-industrial problem, then all of the industrial companies would have to take this path.
The problem is it doesn't change the net consumption model. If you actually go to solar and storage, for every 15 million homes, you take a terawatt hour of demand off the grid. That's an extra terawatt hour that you don't need to build, but you can't build that quickly. So the reason why I like solar and storage is you make these folks so self-reliant. Now, all of a sudden, we're actually catching up to China faster than we would have otherwise.
You're talking about residentials?
Yeah. Your idea, which is a good one, the problem is they're still using grid services.
Right, or they don't have to. That's the point. Like if they end up, because the industrial users, users will then invest in solar systems.
You don't know that for sure. Solar. My point is today the homeowners are using.
Well,
there is no solution to not using.
Yeah, well,
if the industrial price goes up by 50%, you've now created a market force to drive them to make the investment.
I understand.
Particularly if you've deregulated.
I understand the math, but my point is,
you get this first year capex depreciation, so they actually get a benefit. And instead of putting all of the
guys, you're talking through each other. Chamath's point is that you're still taxing the grid. His proposal adds another layer to what you're saying. So he's in agreement with you, Friedberg. Hey, yeah, let's have the businesses pay a little extra, and let's have them
also
off the grid.
Take them off the grid to reduce it.
Well, there's 80 million freestanding homes in the United States, and it's about $15K to put these battery packs in, like Base Power is doing. You can probably get it down to 10. And if you just do back of the envelope math, you're talking about $1 trillion. So basically, for $100 billion, you could do 10% of the country. If you were to do that over some time period, we would stop worrying about the grid, I think, is Chamath's point. And you could do it with battery, you could do it with solar.
Well, you would not stop worrying about the grid, but Jason, just to refine what you're saying, because you're directionally very right, the consumers would feel less of these issues. And instead of all of us worrying how to underwrite terawatt hours to catch up to China, we actually get a 2-for-1. The consumer homes don't have that anxiety anymore. They don't have the bill. And because they're generating their own power, they're off the grid. And now what that means is that extra terawatt hour can actually go to the commercial and industrial applications, including these data centers, And you're right, Friedberg. We should raise their tariffs.
I just think it's a lot more complicated and a lot more expensive to add
your
solar
method
to
is
everyone's
way more
roof.
complicated. No,
Okay, listen, none of this is free. None of it's free. However, we have such an amazing opportunity with AI that it makes sense to do this. That, I think, is the big picture. AI is such a huge opportunity. There's so much invested. Why wouldn't you do this is the question. And if we want to live in the age of abundance and we want to bring the bottom half of the country up and we want affordability, where do people spend their money? Food, groceries, their rent, and their electricity and the utilities. So if we want to figure out a direct way to do this, and for all the hippy dippies who care about the environment and clean energy, this is a win there as well. And it doesn't come out of Americans' pockets and their taxes. It comes out of corporations, which are printing money. If you want to talk about redistribution of wealth, this is a way for the great American Mag 7 corporations to give something back to Americans. And you talked about this, right, Chamath, maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago, that, hey, maybe there would be some way for great corporations to do great things for Americans. The fact that Americans don't think about their water bill that much is a mitzvah. It's a great thing. Now, if they didn't have to think about electricity, wow, amazing.
查马斯指出啊，问题的根源在于美国电力基础设施的长期欠账。在过去的20年里，公用事业公司对电网的投资严重不足啊。美国的电力传输基础设施大部分已经超过40年，早已不堪重负。新建的输入电线路因为许可和选址的延误，往往需要7到10年才能够完成。现在呢，即使微软这些数据中心愿意支付公平的份额，但整体电网的升级和扩建依然会推高所有人的成本。国际能源署就预测，到了2035年，数据中心的一个电力需求将增长超过3倍，从每年200太瓦时飙升到640太瓦时。面对如此巨大的增量，仅仅是让数据中心多付钱是不够的。节目中提出了几个极具颠覆性的构想，其中查马斯的方案是最大胆的，也最具登月计划的色彩。他建议应该由这些盈利能力非常惊人的科技巨头们共同出资设立一个规模高达3000亿到5000亿美元的税收权益基金。这个基金的目的只有一个，为全美5000万到1亿的一个家庭彻底免除电费。具体怎么做呢？用这笔钱为每个家庭安装太阳能电池板和储能电池。查马斯算了一笔账美国大约有8000户独立的一个住宅，为每户居民安装一套储能系统的成本大约在1万到1.5万美元之间。1000亿美元就可以覆盖10%的家庭，如果基金规模达到数千亿，就可以让大部分的美国家庭实现能源自给自足。这个方案有2个好处，一方面呢，居民的电费账单消失了，生活成本大大降低，对 AI 发展的抵触情绪自然也就会烟消云散。另一方面呢，数千万的家庭从电网消费者变成了生产者，他们不再消耗电网的一个电力反而将多余的电力贡献出来。查马斯估算，每改造1500万的家庭就能为电网释放出1太瓦的一个需求，这些被节约出来的电力正好可以供给数据中心和其他的工业用途。节目中还提到了一个有趣的案例Base Power 这家公司，他们的方案不是安装太阳能板，那需要时间空间，还需要拆屋顶，有的屋顶呢可能还不够好拆不够条件，成本非常高昂。他们的做法呢更简单，在你家门口放一个 R2D2 大小的电池储能装置电力便宜然后供应充足的时候呢就充电，电力紧张价格高企的时候就放电。这种方案已经在和一些社区洽谈合作，这相当于科技公司用自己的利润为国家进行了一次能源基础设施的去中心化的升级。这是一个真正的财富再分配，不是通过税收，而是通过企业主动的具有战略眼光的投资。另一位主播弗里伯格则提出了一个更偏向市场驱动的方案，他建议可以从政策层面进行设计，让所有居民用户的电费在一定额度内完全免费，超出这个部分再收费。而为了弥补这部分的成本，将工商业用电的价格直接提高 50%。这个设计的精妙之处在于它创造了一个强大的市场激励。当工商业的电价变得极其昂贵的时候呢，所有的企业不仅仅是数据中心，都会有极强的动力去投资建设自己的发电设施，以降低成本。这会催生出一个庞大的私营发电市场，从根本上解决电力供应不足的问题。政府需要做的就是放松监管，让企业更容易的建设这些设施。弗里伯格还给出了一组数据来支撑这个方案的可行性美国每年的电力消耗大约是4万亿千瓦时，平均电价是18美分每千瓦时，总支出约7500亿美元。其中呢，居民消费占1/3，约2500亿美元；工商业消费占2/3，约5000亿美元。理论上呢，如果将工商业的电价提高 50%， 就可以让所有居民在一定额度内完全免费。 大卫·萨克斯则补充了川普政府一直以来的思路，他提到川普政府从一开始就预见到了这个问题，并希望 AI 公司成为最大的电力公司，这意味着数据中心从设计之初就应该考虑这个自建发电厂这就是所谓的表后发电就是和这个居民的这个电表不是一起的这个又叫做并置。数据中心和发电厂建在一起，电力直接供应而不经过公共的电网。萨克斯认为问题的核心不是需求太大，而是被人为的限制了如果放开管制，让建设新的发电厂，无论是天然气发电厂、核能还是其他形式，能够变得更容易建设，规模经济效应反而会降低所有人的用电成本。他指出美国联邦能源管理委员会的一些过时的规定恰恰阻碍了这种高效模式的发展，而现任的能源部长已经在推动相关的改革。在讨论中，他们还澄清了一个常见的误解数据中心的水资源消耗问题。很多人担心数据中心不仅是电老虎，还是水老虎，但实际上现代数据中心大多采用闭环的冷却系统，水在系统内部循环使用，并不会被大量的消耗。微软也承诺新一代的数据中心设计已经不再需要饮用水来进行冷却，并且 90% 的水可以被重复利用。微软还承诺到2030年将数据中心的用水量强度改善 40%。所谓的水资源危机在很大程度上是一个被夸大的问题，跟电的危机不一样节目中还提到了一个值得关注的国际案例，在法国住在 Avallio 这个核电站附近的居民只需要支付 0.1% 的税费等于是象征性的收税了。那么该地区的平均税率是 12%， 英国也在讨论类似的危险区补贴的一个方案，给住在核电站附近的居民提供免费的电力或者折扣。这种以邻为壑的反向思维呢，或许是也值得美国借鉴的。节目中提到如果美国人不再需要担心水费，那是一件好事，而如果他们不再需要担心电费，那将是一件了不起的好事。这场讨论还引出了一个有趣但是有点危险的结论，如果这个趋势变成现实，那么传统的公用事业公司可能会成为最大的输家。当他们最大的客户，也就是工商业和绝大多数的散户居民都开始脱离这个公用的电网自己发电的时候，这些庞然大物的商业模式将彻底的崩溃，他们的巨额资本开支将无法收回，债券可能违约。查马斯在节目里面的原话是，他认为最大的做空机会会是在这些公用事业公司上。如果他们讨论的任何一个版本成为现实，比如说私人住宅成为自己的电力公司，工商业开始自己发电，那公用事业公司该怎么办呢？他们的资本开支怎么收回呢？债券怎么偿还呢？费率基础会怎样呢？这是一个巨大的经济问题。微软的这次自掏腰包或许是这次伟大变革拉开的一个小小的序幕。更多内容抢先观看，点击下方链接加入频道会员。